London, 1892, the season every debutante dreamed of and one girl feared most. For Lady Eleanor Ashford, society's glitter was not a promise but a quiet torment, a reminder she was no longer free to choose her destiny but a duchess bound by expectation. As her carriage rolled through the iron gates of Hawthorne Hall that frigid evening, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the sense that noble walls had begun closing around her. Inside, laughter fluttered like cold wings. Guests moved through the candlelit corridors, their conversations floating with polished elegance. Eleanor stepped into the entrance hall, poised and serene, though beneath her calm facade lived a heart unsettled by years of distant courtesy from her husband. Duke Edmund of Hawthorne stood at the far end of the room, surrounded by men whose approval mattered more to society than truth. His tall, composed frame betrayed nothing, yet Eleanor sensed the tension in his shoulders, the silence he carried like armor. The whispers began the moment she entered. Still no heir. A dynasty fading. Such fortune wasted without a successor. Eleanor pretended not to hear, gliding past them with every bit of elegance her upbringing demanded. Yet their words clung to her like frost, each syllable a reminder of all she had failed to give. She had never been blamed outright, but the burden always tilted toward her, as if her worth lived only in the cradle that remained empty. She greeted guests with polite warmth, though her gaze drifted toward Edmund. He acknowledged her with a nod, nothing more. Their marriage had become a quiet coexistence, courteous yet starved of tenderness. A jeweled countess leaned in, whispering just loudly enough. One wonders how long before Hawthorne seeks a more productive match. A few gentlemen chuckled. Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks, but she forced her breath steady. She moved toward the grand staircase, but Edmund's voice halted her. "Good evening, Lady Eleanor." It was the most formal greeting a husband could offer, yet there was something softened in his tone. She offered a faint smile. "Your Grace." For a brief moment their eyes met, and Eleanor glimpsed something she could not name, exhaustion perhaps or a fragile hope. But Edmund looked away as quickly as he had looked toward her, returning to his companions. The distance between them felt colder than the winter wind tapping against the windows. The string quartet began a waltz meant to lift spirits, but to Eleanor the music felt like a veil hiding cruelty. She drifted through the crowd, enduring compliments and subtle jabs disguised as inquiries. She heard her name whispered again and again, each time paired with the same verdict: failure. She paused beside a marble column when an older duchess approached, her sympathetic expression sharper than a blade. "My dear, do take care. Women in your position mustn't lose heart, even if certain expectations remain unmet." Eleanor forced a nod. "Your concern is kind. A title without an heir is such a fragile thing." The duchess moved on, leaving Eleanor with an ache she could no longer hide. She turned toward a window, letting a cool draft brush her cheek. Somewhere behind her laughter erupted, sharp, careless. She wondered if Edmund felt the sting as deeply as she did. They had never spoken of it, not truly. Silence had become their shared refuge and their shared prison. As the night deepened, Eleanor contemplated retreating to her chambers. But as she moved toward the staircase again, she caught sight of Edmund standing alone near a marble statue. His companions had stepped away. For a fleeting moment, he looked unbearably human, stripped of his ducal armor. His gaze lingered on the ballroom as if he, too, heard every whisper carved against his name. Their eyes met again. This time neither looked away. Something in his expression shifted, a subtle apology or perhaps a plea. Eleanor felt her breath catch. She had seen him composed and distant, but never vulnerable. Before she could approach, a trio of ladies swept between them. She answered their questions mechanically, her thoughts returning to Edmund's unguarded expression. It unsettled her because it stirred something long dormant, the belief that their marriage might still hold unspoken possibilities. Yet the evening had one more cruelty to deliver. As the music paused, the Marquis of Ellingsworth raised his voice just enough to carry. "I suppose the Hawthorne line must rely on its cousins. A shame, one expects more of a duke." Laughter followed. Eleanor glanced at Edmund, expecting him to ignore the jab, but this time he stiffened, his jaw tightening. For the briefest moment, anger lit his eyes. Eleanor took a step toward him, intending to offer comfort she had long withheld. But before she reached him, the ballroom doors opened for another wave of guests, drowning the moment in ceremony. Still, the image of Edmund's wounded pride lingered. And as the crowd surged anew, Eleanor understood, with a clarity that shook her, that the whispers were no longer merely insults. They were the force slowly breaking the man she had vowed to stand beside. She drew a steadying breath, sensing the night had begun to shift toward something inevitable, something that would demand courage from them both. She lingered near the edge of the hall, watching him from a distance she no longer wished to keep. For years she had believed her silence was a form of grace, a way to spare him the weight of her own uncertainty. Yet now, seeing the weariness etched along his brow, she realized how isolation had shaped them both. She wondered what might have changed had she dared to speak earlier, had she let him know she never saw him as inadequate but as a man carrying more than any heart should bear alone. Perhaps the cruelty of society had thrived because neither she nor Edmund had learned how to stand together. And tonight, for the first time, she felt an urge to bridge the distance. Tragedy arrived before dawn, not with thunder or shouting, but with the quiet cruelty of ink. The morning papers, still damp from the press, carried a headline that struck Hawthorne Hall like a blow. Duke Edmund expected to seek annulment amid Heir scandal. Every servant who handled it went rigid with dread, yet the gossip outran them, spilling into London's drawing rooms before the sun had fully risen. Eleanor learned of it when a trembling maid delivered the discarded newspaper found at the gate. She read the line twice, then a third time, each repetition hollowing her chest. The article suggested that her marriage, already fragile, was not only failing but would soon be officially dissolved. It implied she was the obstacle, the barren duchess, the reason the Hawthorne lineage stood on the brink of extinction. She gripped the paper until her hands shook. The notion of annulment had never crossed her mind. Edmund, for all his distance, had never spoken so callously. But the world did not need truth to injure, it needed only something believable enough to wound. She moved through the morning in a haze, trying to dismiss the lie, yet fear clung to her thoughts like a lingering fog. If society believed Edmund wished to replace her, would he be pressured to consider it? Would the whispers become prophecy? When Edmund entered the breakfast room, his expression grave, she braced herself. He carried a copy of the same newspaper, the creases deep where his fingers had tightened around it. "You have seen this," he said, setting it on the table. His voice was controlled, but Eleanor detected the simmering beneath it. "It is false." "I know," she answered, though her voice was little more than a whisper. Edmund paced once, twice, the way he did when his composure wavered. "They question my honor, my marriage, and more offensively, your dignity." He stopped, meeting her eyes. "I will not allow this." Eleanor wanted to believe him, to let his certainty ease her fears, but doubt lingered. "Your Grace, these rumors often begin as seeds planted by those who know something we do not." Edmund's jaw tightened, a flash of hurt crossing his face. "Eleanor, do you believe I would cast you aside?" She opened her mouth, unsure how to answer without revealing the insecurity that had taken root over months of distance. Before she could speak, he turned away, his disappointment softened only by the exhaustion in his shoulders. "The charity ball will proceed as planned. If society wishes to speak, I will give them something worth speaking of." The declaration puzzled her, but the moment closed as he dismissed himself to attend to letters and meetings. Eleanor sat alone, suddenly unsure whether she had offended him or merely revealed how fragile she felt in their marriage. As days passed, preparations for the winter charity ball consumed the estate. Hawthorne Hall swelled with activity. Footmen polishing banisters, maids airing gowns, musicians rehearsing in the distant gallery. Eleanor, responsible for much of the event's organization, found solace in the tasks. They kept her from dwelling on the article, though she carried its sting in every breath. One afternoon, while reviewing the guest list in her quiet study, she discovered the first of Edmund's unexpected gestures. A single winter rose, rare, grown only in the heated conservatory, lay upon her writing desk. Its petals were ivory with a faint blush at the edges, delicate and impossibly soft. Beneath it, a card bore only 2 words, "For courage." Eleanor touched the rose gently, surprised by the warmth gathering in her chest. Edmund had never offered such a kindness, not even in the early days of their marriage when diplomacy might have demanded it. She lingered on the gesture, tracing the edges of the card, wondering if the distance between them had thinned without her noticing. She kept the rose in a small vase beside her inkstand, glancing at it whenever the echoes of gossip threatened to overwhelm her. The night of the charity ball arrived with bitter wind clawing through the courtyard. Inside, however, the hall glowed with golden warmth. Guests flowed in beneath glittering chandeliers, the air filled with refined laughter and murmured greetings. Eleanor greeted each visitor gracefully, though tension thrummed under her ribs. She knew the article would be a silent guest at every conversation. Edmund appeared at her side unexpectedly. "You look," he paused, searching for the proper Victorian restraint. "You look very well this evening, Eleanor." Her heart tripped. Compliments were not common between them. "Thank you, Your Grace." For a moment, it felt as if they stood not as strangers bound by duty, but as two people tentatively reaching toward one another. But before she could savor it, the undercurrent of gossip began. She caught fragments, intonations of pity, smirks concealed behind fans, a barbed comment about her gown being yet another attempt to distract from the real issue. Still she held her head high. The ballroom orchestra began its first waltz. Edmund accepted greetings from dignitaries, but Eleanor noticed he never strayed far from her. His gaze flickered toward her with increasing frequency, as if ensuring she had not wilted beneath the scrutiny. She wondered if he realized how much that small vigilance meant. Then came the escalation. A cluster of gentlemen near the punch table discussed the article openly, their voices low but not low enough. "The annulment is the only sensible path," one said. "A duke must think of the line, not sentiment." Another replied, "Sentiment? I doubt there is any. Their marriage was nothing more than politics." The word struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She excused herself, moving through the crowd until the candlelight blurred. She reached the far corridor, where the murmur of the ballroom softened into distant hum. She leaned against the wall, breathing slowly, determined not to let tears fall. Footsteps approached. She stiffened, preparing to offer some polite dismissal. But when she lifted her gaze, Edmund stood before her, having clearly followed. His expression was a storm barely contained. "What did they say to you?" "No one addressed me directly," she replied, her voice trembling despite her efforts. But the whispers grow louder. Edmund exhaled sharply, his control strained. "I will not tolerate another word against you." "You cannot silence all of London," she said softly. "No," he answered, stepping closer, "but I can show them the truth." She blinked, uncertain what he meant. But before she could ask, he offered his arm, his voice low but resolute. "Come back to the ballroom with me." Her pulse quickened, a fragile thread of hope weaving through her fear. She placed her hand upon his arm, and together they walked toward the gilded doors. But just as they reached the threshold, a hush rippled across the crowd. Someone had arrived with news that would change everything. Disaster struck with the swiftness of a whispered curse, slipping through the ballroom before anyone understood its meaning. A breathless footman, pale and shaken, stepped inside and murmured something to the steward, who stiffened as though struck. Within seconds, a ripple of unease spread across the crowd, soft but unmistakable, the kind of murmur that carried dread more effectively than any shout. Eleanor, still standing beside Edmund at the threshold, felt the shift immediately. It was not the clamor of scandal, nor the petty thrill of gossip. It was something colder, sharper, as if the very air had been carved open. The steward approached Edmund with hesitant steps, bowing low before whispering urgently into his ear. Eleanor watched Edmund's expression harden, though his features remained controlled. He dismissed the steward with a curt nod, then turned to Eleanor with an unreadable gaze. "We must step away for a moment," he said quietly. There was no room for argument. His tone bore the weight of responsibility, not irritation. As they left the ballroom, the murmurs behind them swelled, yet no one dared follow. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly on Edmund's arm, though she hoped he had not noticed. The corridor they entered was dim and cool, a striking contrast to the heat and brightness of the ballroom. Only once the doors closed behind them did Edmund stop. He seemed to struggle for the right words, a rare vulnerability she had not seen in him openly. "There has been an attempt to circulate a second article," he said slowly, claiming that the annulment is already in motion. Eleanor's breath caught. "Already? Published?" "No," Edmund answered. "But written, delivered, and prepared for the morning edition unless I intervene." The thought of such humiliation, another blow before she had recovered from the first, sent a sharp ache through her chest. What more could they possibly say? "That I have sought legal counsel. That I seek freedom," Edmund replied bitterly. "That our marriage is an arrangement I intend to dismantle." Eleanor looked away, unable to bear the sting of his words even as she knew he did not believe them. "I suppose they expect you to deny it publicly," she murmured. "I will," he said firmly. "But it seems my silence until now has allowed these lies to flourish." The quiet in the corridor thickened, laden with unspoken truths. Eleanor folded her hands to still the trembling, but the effort did little to calm the rush of fear. "Why have you never addressed the rumors directly?" The question escaped before she could frame it more delicately. Edmund exhaled, the doubt in her voice piercing him more deeply than the articles ever could. "Because I believed acknowledging them would give them life," he answered. "And because," he hesitated. Because what? She whispered. Because I feared you might think me ashamed of you. The confession struck her with unexpected force. She turned toward him fully, stunned by the raw honesty shaping his expression. Ashamed? Edmund, I never. You flinched when I asked if you believed the article. He interrupted, not accusing, merely pained. You feared I might cast you aside. That fear did not come from nowhere. Eleanor lowered her gaze, ashamed of how her insecurities had crept between them. We have lived quietly, she said softly. Too quietly. I did not know what you felt because you rarely showed anything at all. Edmund stepped closer, close enough that she felt the tension thrumming through him. I kept my distance because I feared disappointing you, he confessed. I feared becoming another man who turned his frustrations upon his wife. I know the weight society has placed on you, Eleanor. I saw it long before I learned how deeply it wounded you. She swallowed, emotions knotting in her throat. Then why did you never say so? Why did you let us become strangers in our own home? I thought silence would spare you, he said. But I see now that silence can wound far more than truth. The corridor felt transformed, no longer a space of retreat but an intimate chamber where both their defenses had been stripped away. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with new steadiness. I never needed perfection, she said. Only honesty. For a moment neither moved. Their breaths mingled in the stillness, a fragile bridge forming between them. Edmund reached for her hand, a tentative gesture as though fearing rejection. Eleanor let him take it, her fingers trembling as they curled around his. I will speak tonight, he vowed. Not in anger nor in denial, but in defense of what should have never been questioned. Eleanor felt warmth surge through her, a fragile but unmistakable hope. And what will you say? That my marriage is not an arrangement to dismantle, he answered softly. But a bond one have not valued as openly as I should. She felt her pulse quicken, her heart tipping toward him in a way she had not allowed in years. Edmund? But before she could shape another word, the distant swell of ballroom music resumed, muffled through the doors. A reminder that society waited beyond the corridor, hungry for spectacle. Edmund squeezed her hand gently. Walk with me back in, he said. Let them see us together. She nodded, though a flicker of apprehension remained. They may still whisper. Then let them whisper, he replied with quiet steel. I am done hiding from shadows. They walked toward the doors, steps slow, breaths aligned, something long dormant awakening between them. Perhaps understanding. Perhaps courage. Perhaps the earliest flicker of something like affection. Just as Edmund reached for the door handle, a servant hurried toward them, face tight with urgency. Your Grace, he said, bowing deeply, a messenger has arrived from London. The editor himself. He requests immediate audience. Eleanor's pulse stopped. Edmund's expression darkened. And in that suspended moment, standing at the threshold between truth and rumor, courage and collapse, Eleanor realized that whatever happened next would either bind them together or tear open everything they had just begun to mend. Boom, the rumor struck before dawn, tearing through Hawthorne Court with the force of a storm. By the time Eleanor stepped into the corridor, still fastening the ribbon of her morning gown, she sensed tension pooled in the air like unspoken thunder, every whisper sliding beneath doors and echoing along the floors. She saw it first in the stiff way the footmen bowed, in the averted eyes of the maids, in the hurried rustle of skirts that suggested something unseen pressing on the household. She descended the staircase with measured grace, the composure she had learned to wield like a shield in society's relentless arena. Even so, her thoughts churned with possibilities until she reached the breakfast room and found Edmund standing at the window, shoulders rigid beneath the weight of unspoken news. He did not turn when she entered, but the faint tremor in his breath revealed that whatever rumor had surfaced, it concerned something deeper than idle gossip. Edmund, she said softly, and though she spoke only his name, it seemed enough to break through his silence. He turned to her with a measured calm that fooled no one. His eyes carried the fatigue of a man too accustomed to judgment, too practiced at masking wounds inflicted not by enemies but by those who claimed to know him. He gestured toward the table, where a folded letter lay like a serpent awaiting discovery. Eleanor reached for it, but he spoke first. You may read it, though I wish you did not have to, he murmured. His voice held the weight of sleepless reflection, as though he had battled the words alone through the night. Eleanor unfolded the letter with steady fingers, yet as she scanned the lines she felt heat rise beneath her skin. Accusations that Edmund had secretly arranged for a distant cousin to inherit the estate, whispering that he had finally conceded defeat in the matter of an heir. The implication was cruelly clear. Society claimed he had abandoned hope altogether. Her breath caught, not because she believed the slander but because she knew precisely how deeply it would wound him. She lifted her gaze to Edmund, whose expression remained stoic though his eyes betrayed a flicker of despair. "This is venom," she whispered. "Nothing more." But Edmund shook his head. "It does not matter if it is false," he replied quietly. "What matters is that it has already traveled through London. They will say I never trusted in our union. They will say I have surrendered to fate." Eleanor felt her heart constrict. She reached for his hand, something she rarely initiated, and he looked at the gesture as though it were a lifeline he had not dared to grasp. "I know you better than they ever will," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. "And I know the truth of your heart." Edmund exhaled as though releasing a burden he had carried far too long. He allowed her fingers to intertwine with his, and for a moment, the room softened around them. Yet the moment shattered when a knock sounded at the door. The butler entered with an apologetic bow, announcing the arrival of Lady Ashcombe, Edmund's formidable aunt, who never visited unannounced unless compelled by urgent matters or scandalous delight. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Edmund, whose jaw tightened. "Let her in," he said, though his tone revealed he expected little mercy. Lady Ashcombe swept inside like a tempest wrapped in silk, her gaze sharp enough to cut through any pretense. She did not bother with greetings. "So it is true," she declared. "The ton is aflame with talk of your arrangements, Edmund. And if you think silence will shield you, you are mistaken." Eleanor stepped forward, placing herself subtly between aunt and husband. "The letter is false," she said firmly. "Cruelly fabricated." Lady Ashcombe raised an eyebrow. "My dear, innocence is a virtue you wear beautifully, but do not confuse it with influence. The world judges not only him but you. Your marriage will be dissected." Edmund bristled, but Eleanor held her ground. "Then let them dissect," she replied. "We stand united, and that will silence them." The older woman studied her with grudging respect. "Unity is noble," she said, "but appearances are stronger. If you wish to quell this storm you must be seen, together, unwavering." And with that, she departed as swiftly as she had come, leaving a silence heavy enough to feel physical. Eleanor turned to Edmund, who looked torn between gratitude and frustration. "She is right in her way," Eleanor admitted. "But we cannot simply perform unity. We must live it." Edmund searched her face, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the fragile distance they had preserved could no longer protect them. They either stood together or risked being crushed separately beneath society's expectations. Before he could respond, a young footman rushed in, breathless. "My lord, my lady, the newspapers have arrived. They speak of the matter on the front page." Eleanor felt a chill sweep through her. Edmund took the newspaper but did not open it. Instead, he looked at her with a question in his eyes, as though asking whether she would still stand with him once the world's judgment was laid bare. She nodded once, steady and unwavering. He unfolded the paper. And whatever he saw there drained the color from his face, leaving Eleanor to wonder what new cruelty awaited them in the printed truth. In the heartbeat that followed, the room seemed to shrink around them, every ticking second sharpening the dread coiling in Eleanor's chest. Edmund's fingers tightened ever so slightly on the edge of the page, a subtle tremor betraying the storm gathering within him. Eleanor stepped closer, drawn by instinct rather than courage, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked, "Edmund, what do they claim now?" But he did not answer. He only lowered the paper enough for her to see his shaken eyes. Boom struck again when the morning paper revealed a headline sharper than any whispered rumor, a blow aimed straight at the fragile hope Edmund and Eleanor had begun to nurture. It declared that Parliament questioned Hawthorne's stability and urged an inquiry into the succession, implying the estate might soon be seized by distant relatives. The words were cold, legal, and merciless, carrying the weight of a verdict before any defense could be offered. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her as she realized this was no longer gossip but a public dismantling of Edmund's honor. He stood rigid, absorbing the blow with the stoicism of a man long accustomed to undeserved defeat, yet something in his eyes flickered with a plea he did not voice. Eleanor stepped closer, refusing to let fear speak louder than loyalty, and placed a steady hand upon his arm. "They can question ink and paper," she murmured, "but they cannot question us." Her certainty seemed to anchor him, and he drew a slow breath as if reclaiming a part of himself lost to years of humiliation. Still, the household trembled with unease, for everyone sensed that the scandal would soon demand a public response. Lady Ashcombe returned before noon, her urgency barely contained as she insisted they attend the upcoming winter assembly, where the whispers of London would gather like vultures awaiting their feast. Eleanor knew it would be a battlefield of propriety and malice, but she also knew retreat would only feed the narrative that Edmund had surrendered. So she lifted her chin and declared she would accompany him, her voice steady enough to surprise even herself. Edmund looked at her then with a gratitude so profound it softened every sharp line of worry on his face. "You give me courage, Eleanor," he said quietly, "more than I have ever possessed alone." The night of the assembly arrived with a chill wind sweeping through the streets, carrying with it the sharp anticipation of judgment. As they entered the grand hall, conversations faltered and eyes sharpened, for nothing pleased the crowd more than witnessing the rise or fall of a noble reputation. Eleanor walked beside Edmund with quiet elegance, her arm linked with his, her gaze unwavering despite the tide of curiosity pressing in from all sides. Some murmured that she looked pale, others whispered that Edmund appeared defeated, but a few, observing closely, sensed a determination that had not been there before. When the musicians paused between sets, a member of Parliament approached Edmund with the polite arrogance of someone who believed himself the arbiter of all noble conduct. He questioned Edmund's intentions with veiled disdain, implying the estate required a more secure lineage, as though Eleanor's presence were nothing more than ornament. Eleanor felt indignation flare, but before she could speak, Edmund straightened, meeting the man's gaze with a steadiness that stilled the surrounding murmurs. "My lineage is secure," Edmund said, his voice calm yet resolute, "because my wife stands with me." The declaration rippled through the hall, startling those who had expected meekness but receiving admiration from those who respected courage more than gossip. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she held them back, for this was not the moment for softness but for solidarity. As the couple moved toward the center of the hall, applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling with genuine respect. Yet the moment that followed would eclipse even that unexpected triumph, for as the music resumed and they took their place on the floor, Eleanor felt a sudden wave of dizziness unlike anything she had known. Edmund noticed immediately, his hand tightening around hers, his expression sharpening with concern as he guided her discreetly toward a quieter corner. She tried to steady herself, but a warmth bloomed low within her, a sensation both startling and unmistakably profound. When she met Edmund's gaze, she saw worry etched deeply there, yet she also sensed he feared another blow from fate rather than anything hopeful. She placed a trembling hand over his and whispered words that would change everything. "Edmund, I believe I am with child." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to fall utterly silent, as though even the music paused to witness the shattering of one destiny and the awakening of another. Edmund's breath left him in a quiet rush, his eyes widening first with disbelief, then with a dawning hope so radiant it softened every shadow that had ever clung to him. He cupped her hands in his voice unsteady as he asked whether she was certain, whether fate had truly chosen this moment to restore what had long been denied. Eleanor nodded, tears now slipping freely, not from fear but from overwhelming relief that their whispered hopes had taken root in the most undeniable way. Edmund drew her into a careful embrace, shielding her not from scandal but from the rush of emotions that threatened to unmake them both. When they emerged again into the light of the assembly, their joined hands told a story louder than any proclamation, and the crowd responded with a reverence neither had expected. Some gasped, some wept, and others simply bowed their heads, recognizing that hope had risen where despair once reigned. Edmund addressed the room with quiet authority, declaring that a new chapter had begun for Hawthorne, not forged by pressure but by love that had endured every cruelty set against it. Eleanor felt her heart swell as applause thundered around them, transforming a night meant for their humiliation into a celebration of their resilience. Later, as they stepped outside into the crisp air, Edmund paused, turning to her with an expression that held both wonder and solemnity, as though he finally understood the magnitude of the future unfolding before them. "You have given me more than hope," he whispered. "You have given me a legacy shaped not by duty but by devotion." Eleanor smiled softly, sensing that their greatest journey was only beginning beneath the stars.